They deserve all the credit.
Wow. Well, I mean, it must. I mean, how do you walk into a prison and transform it like that? It was the most violent, right, or known as one of the most violent prisons, and then you transformed it into one of the, prisons that had the best, rehabilitation programs. What is that?
Right.
How do you do that?
Well, what I did is, right after my first week, I gave myself a charge, and that charge was that I was not going to sit behind a desk and listen to people come to tell me what they think is going on inside the prison. And so I found a young teacher in the education department, and I told him that he could be the warden. He could sit behind my desk all day and take care of phone calls and my mail and whatnot, and I would be inside if I was needed. And so I would go in and spend the whole day early on just walking and talking to staff and inmates. And early on, there weren't many inmates that wanted to talk to me. They were thinking that I was probably trying to develop a bunch of stitches and just trying to get information to do some bad things again. And they had enough of that kind of stuff.
Right.
It didn't take long. People started to open up, and we talked a lot about everything. And it's funny how it works. Like people early on would come to me and said, "Look at these shoes. I'm trying to get a pair of shoes, and the storeroom won't give me shoes." And so I would make sure that the guy got shoes. I had a little notebook I carried with me, and I wrote that stuff down, gave it to my secretary, and told her that by the next day they've got to get a response memo and the shoes, if possible, by the next day. And so that helped a lot. And another question that I got an awful lot is I can't get my next parole hearing date from the classification department. And so I'd go to classification, and sure enough, they just didn't feel like they wanted to answer those kites, they called them, from inmates. So we straightened that out pretty quick, and guys were getting inmates. There's a bunch of stuff just like that I took care of early on, and the fact that I was inside, walking and talking and ready to help out in any way that I can. And the same with staff. I get on their butt a little bit because, if the brass wasn't shining, I made sure they shined that brass every day wherever there was brass, and that the floors were cleaned. And even though it was an early 1900s prison, we're going to try to keep it looking as good as possible as we could. So it really helped. It broke the ice. They found out who I was and that I was there to help. I wasn't there, to punish. Punish wasn't my job. Punishment wasn't my job. That was the job of the judge when they sent them there. My job was to do something with them if they wanted to go home. And I was a believer in self-rehabilitation. I felt that any man, and I don't want to call them inmates, so I'll refer to them as men, any man that wanted to get their heads on straight, to go home and have a job and be ready to be a crime-free citizen, going from criminal behavior to non-criminal behavior. And I was going to help them do that. And we'd have programs, and we'd have things that they could do. And one of the things that helped a lot was with this self-rehabilitation, I set up groups. We call them self-rehabilitation groups. And any inmate that had an idea or had a group and they wanted to do something, I kind of helped them make it happen. One of an early story, I was in my first week at Rahway, and I got into the prison about 5 o'clock in the morning that day. I wanted to see what was happening on the end of the graveyard shift. And when I walked into the prison, I heard singing, harmonizing. I asked the officer, "What the hell is going on?" "Oh, they're the escorts. They're singing, practicing under the staircase." I said, "Well, why did you let them out? The person's supposed to be locked up tight. What, until 6 o'clock? Well, he had a lot of excuses. But anyway, I went and talked to them, and sure enough, they were the escorts, and they were telling me they don't have a place to practice, and that their goal was they wanted to do something with their singing in their future. So that was my first group.
Wow.
The first group that I set up were the singers. And so we went from singing under the staircase to singing in the practicing in the same auditorium where we had the riot was held in 1971.
Wow.
And my charge to myself was I was going to transform that space from a riot space to a positive program space. And the escorts were first. And so they practiced. And one of the things that happened early on was George Carr, he was the producer, I guess, of the record company that they wanted to get hooked up with. He came to me and he said, "Well, I want to get these guys to go out to Newark to the Symphony Hall
Wow.
to do a live concert." I said, "Man, you know what? You're asking me to go to jail. How am I going to let maximum security persons out of this prison to go to Newark, New Jersey, and do a live concert?"
Wow.
Well, long story short, we found that I had the authority to create something called an escorted furlough, and people in maximum custody were in fact eligible to be out on furlough. So that's what I did. I got 7 of them or 6 of them, all maximum security guys out of prison with 5 escorts, officers that I knew and trusted, to Newark Symphony Hall. They did one hell of a show, you know. They called me up on a stage to get an award, and I looked out into the audience, and I was the only white face in the place.
I think that's just.
But anyway, it was quite a concert. It really went well. The New York Times did a big story on it. So that was the start of the groups. The next thing that next group that we started was I had lifers, a lot of lifers, and I took the time to calculate how much time would have to be served by all of them for them when they were to go. It turned out to 1,300 years.
Wow.
Would have to be served. Oh man, I got to find something for these guys to do. You know, some of them got to be troublemakers. And so, but if I can get something for them to do, we'll have a shot at doing something. So I had a meeting with all of the lifers in the prison. I said, "Look, I've got an idea. I want to create a group, and I want to call it the Lifers Group. What do you guys think?" "Well, what do you mean Lifers Group?" I said, "We're gonna have to figure out what project or enterprise we can get you guys hooked up with, something that you could do for yourself as a group, or the prisoners, or the men in the prison, or even to the community at large." Well, it turned out that that took a lot of work, but it turned out that we ended up with a group that we called the Lifers Group. They formed what they call the Lifers Juvenile Awareness Program, which I supported. They invited me to the auditorium one day and said, "Hey, we want to talk to juveniles, and here's what we want to say." So they did their thing, and there was a lot of profanity, and they said, "You know what, this can't work. I mean, it really can't work. You can't talk to kids like that." But anyway, we did it, and it became a phenomenon, and it became something called Scared Straight. And the only thing that I'm sad about is that the guys, the men, didn't get all the acclamation that they should have. The people who did the film Scared Straight seemed to get all of the glory and all the publicity and all of the money, I guess, that was made. And my guys sitting behind that wall, they got nothing.
Wow.
Not really. And that was hard for me to take. But anyway, we allowed them to create albums inside the prison, which was I think first in the country. Their first album, All We Want Is Another Chance, sold over 300,000 copies.
Wow.
When it hit the street. So here's a group of guys getting ready to go home, and that was my objective. They were getting ready to go home. They had something that they could walk out the door with,
right,
and do and earn a living, and it worked extremely well. You know, what's funny, I saw something on YouTube not long ago. Three men from the original, I guess it was from the original Escorts, maybe 10 years ago, did a show in Harlem. three of them, and it was quite a show. So they were still going up until a few years ago as a group called the Escorts. So it's from the 70s until now.
Wow.
It's like 40 years. So did it work for them? Absolutely. They had a way out of prison. They had a way to earn a living. They had a way to support their family, and it just all worked out. They didn't come back.
Okay.
So then the next thing that happened was my third group was I got a call from one of my captains, and he said, "Boss, they're releasing some men that have been segregated for a couple of years. Some of them were segregated in the room building readjustment unit, and the others were segregated here at the prison, at Trenton Prison. And the reason that they were segregated is that they were two Muslim groups. And one was the New World of Islam, and one was the Nation of Islam. And they were in bloody wars out on the street and inside the prison. And I was told that I'm going to get at Rahway some of these men from each of those facilities. And the last thing I wanted is to have holy wars at Rahway, and I needed to figure out something that I could do to help prevent that. And what I wanted to do was to get something for these two groups, and for each group to have something very important to lose if they acted out. And that worked out. We on the one side we had Scott, the New World of Islam. We had James Scott, and we had his inmate manager Albert Dickens. On the other side, the New Nation of Islam, we had Murad Muhammad. He worked for Muhammad Ali in security, and he was the old world of inmates and Nation of Islam. And you know what? There wasn't a single disciplinary charge written on those guys in that boxing school. I had 75 men, and it wasn't just a boxing school. I called it a boxing trade school.
Wow.
I wanted guys to learn how to box, how to be cornermen, how to be cutmen, and in all the trades that surround boxing, so that they could go home and earn a living. Well, wouldn't you know that Jersey Joe Walcott became a friend of mine. He was the boxing commissioner in New Jersey.
Wow.
And he supported us a heck of a lot. And so I went to Joe and I said, "Joe, I've got guys who've been working hard, and we need to get some of them licensed so that, they're not going to be able to go home without a license and make some money." And so we had the first inmate in the nation licensed as a professional referee, Eddie Johnson.
Wow.
And so Eddie was ready to go home. Eddie went home and he did refereeing, and he worked in a county recreation department for 30 years, and he did good. So we had guys like that were in the trades. We had one guy who was really famous, and that was James Scott, and that was a whole other story. I got him. I sent a captain to the room building when they were all still segregated, and I asked the captain. I said, I knew Scotty. I said, "Go see Scotty and see if he wanted to come to Rahway. I'd be willing to take him out of segregation to Rahway, but he'd have to come to Rahway with something to do. I didn't want him to get into trouble, and I had an idea. I wanted to start a boxing program, and I want Scotty to run it." Well, the captain told me I was nuts. Why? What do you mean a boxing school? Anyway, Scotty got released. He came to Rahway and started the school. It was called the Boxing Association. That was our third group. And they helped promote a number of fights that were on national television. And Scott ended up getting ranked first or second, I guess, in the world by WBA. And that I have one real regret with that Scott situation. The Scott situation was I got into a little bit of trouble with Scared Straight. There was some bad publicity by some researchers that were researching juvenile crime, who never had a solution about anything, but they had a lot of stuff that they wrote about. But here was a group of inmates who had a solution. May not be the best solution, and the guys doing the research, they couldn't stand that here were researchers doing better than them, the inmates doing better than them, and so it caused my boss to. We got a lot of publicity. My boss got real concerned that he was hearing footsteps. He was hearing my footsteps because there was just so much publicity about Scared Straight, and I was getting so wrapped up in the publicity, and I got none. I refused. And so he chose to move me out of my job to another job behind a desk in the central office.
Wow.
And not long after that, everything just went to pot. But anyway, the regret that I have is that shortly before I got moved, I was about 2 weeks away to do for James Scott what I did for the escorts. I was going to send Scotty out for a half a day to go fight for the title. And Bob Arum said he wanted to promote it. It was, we were on a real fast train and we were going to make it happen. And I got moved just before a week before I could pull it off. And so I couldn't make it. It's really a regret that I have. I wish I had worked faster and seen the handwriting on the wall.
Yeah.
And taken care of that business before I left.
Okay, I got something I want to ask, sir. Looking back over your career, was the single most impactful policy or decision you made that you're the most proud of?
Single most what, sir?
The most single impactful policy or political decision you made that you were proud of as you look back over your career, sir?
One of the first things I did when I went in, I met with the Correctional Officers Union, and I met with the inmate population and the people that represented them, the inmate council. And I had a policy that I was going to put out. There are 14 points in the policy, and the policy was hands off. And I explained to them what I meant. I said, we're going to have a system around here where we're not going to put our hands on each other. We're not going to put our hands on you. You're not going to put your hands on us. And here are the rules about all of that. And so I'm really proud of that because our situation of even disciplinary charge being written on inmates for assault on another inmate or assault on an officer went down to zero. It really wasn't happening. And so I think probably that's the thing I'm most proud of. And the other thing I think I'm most proud of is to establish this whole inmate group concept, which I wish somebody would pick up today, and maybe it can't be done today, but I wish somebody would give it a try because it works for me. I was able to get guys in the programs that they wanted to be in, not programs that I was going to tell them to be in. Look, you're going to be an electrician, and you go to electrical school, and I wanted them to tell me what I wanted to do, they wanted to do. Then I wanted to help them make that happen. It's like boxing. It's like the escorts, and turned out we had 13 groups like that. One of the riot demands, and this is another thing that I'm proud of. One of the riot demands, when I went to Rahway, 2 years after the riot demands, there were 9 of them, had not been addressed. Can you imagine that? That nobody addressed them. The administration, the prison didn't do anything about them. The state people didn't do anything about them. So I had to get busy. I had 9 of them to deal with. The very first demand was medical care. They said that aspirin is the favorite drug, a cure-all for anything here at Rahway, and we need a better medical system. Well, I thought that was pretty serious, and I got to looking into it, and one of the things that we came up with, it's not necessarily my invention, but it was, again, a bunch of inmates and staff working on this. We created what we called an on-foot ambulance. I wanted some inmates to go to the Rahway Hospital, get trained as EMTs. I wanted them to come back to Rahway, and I wanted them to carry backpacks with what they needed and stretchers or what they needed to respond to an emergency on the yard, anywhere in the yard, 20 acres, within 5 minutes. Wow. And you know what they did it? The first guy, we saved his life. The guy was having this stroke. So I'm pretty proud of that. That lasted a long time. And the guys got trained as EMTs so they could go home with an EMT whenever you get a license. And we had more people go through that. And so I'm pretty proud of handling those riot demands. And so are the inmates. I made the inmates part of a team with me and the officers and them to try to figure out how we were going to resolve demands because some of those guys weren't even there. But I said, I'll be damned if I'm going to walk out of here someday and we still had not riot demands that weren't dealt with 2 years later. And you know what? We got them all done. So I'm pretty proud of that too. And a lot of good stuff came out of it.
Go ahead, Harold. Go ahead.
I got another question that, just really kind of interesting to me. How many inmates and their loved ones would you say benefited from, the policy you created and implemented?
Well, let's start with violence. After I left, I did a study, and I found that the violence in Rahway Prison decreased by 63% during the 6 years I was there. And so that's hands-off policy and working with people that understand that we're going to get along, we're going to be able to talk through problems, we're not going to fight with one another. That worked because there was a significant decrease in the violence. Let's see. Could you remind me again what the rest of it was? I'm 85 and slipping a little bit.
Well, I would just want to know, what your policies create and how they help the families. But my follow-up question is pretty simple as far as I'm concerned. I just want to, in your career, do you believe there was an issue or decision that you made while working in the penal system in regards to the perceived degradation or destruction of the African-American man for generations that may have significantly affected or altered life for the black man and their family?
Right. And I challenge you to get a periodical called Combat and Incarceration. It's not very old. It was written in the 20s, and it was about the Rahway program. And he addressed that. They addressed that problem, how I attacked the Afro-American situation at Rahway and the kinds of things that we did. And he was quite complimentary they were quite complimentary to the box squad. I asked you to read that, so that'll give you a good clue about to the answer. But today, I'm proud. We've got Scared Straight still going on around the world. I mean, that's something. Almost 50 years later, it's going on around the world, and they're dealing with all kinds of kids, all kinds of backgrounds and races and religions, and they're making a lot of progress. They've been doing it for almost 60 years. The other thing I'm proud of is the boxing school. In Louisiana. In Louisiana, they started about a week after I started, and they're still going today.
What's the name of it? What's the name of the boxing program?
Angola Prison in Louisiana.
Oh, wow. And I have a question.
And it's still going today. I was on the internet about a month ago, and I found a YouTube. You might want to look at this. A video where what we did in our boxing program was copied in Thailand, and they're letting guys fight their way out of prison. And that was my goal with Scotty. Scotty had a long sentence, and I was, if I could get him to win that title, that championship, I was going to work like hell to get him to go home. And in Thailand, that's exactly what they're doing. That's what I wanted to do, to use the program to help guys to get early paroles, to get out of prison and do the things that we wanted to do. The other thing I'm really proud of, a couple of black guys, I guess he's called Dwight Kwawi Muhammad right now. He was in the boxing school. He went out and won the light heavyweight championship when he got on parole, and he won the cruiserweight championship. That's a real testimony to the work that James Scott did in that boxing school. Scotty not only trained, but he ran that school, and he did a damn good job running the school. So I'm really proud of that. Kwawi, I'm really proud of him winning the championship. Eddie Johnson getting his license, and if I could have stayed there for another 10 years, we'd have had a lot more that we could have boasted about.
Wow. What would you say, Bob, what would you say to young people in relationship to going and being in gyms, staying in the boxing gym versus being out in the street and getting into trouble? What would you say to them? If you could give them a message, what would that message be, Bob?
Well, the message we worked with was we looked at boxing as a form of boxing in prison, as a form of what the literature today calls desistance. And desistance is all about taking people who have criminal behavior in their histories and are still in that mode, and transforming into non-criminal behavior. So it's called desistance today, but we call it the groups, and it was the same form of desistance. And we had actually 3 hooks for change in our prison. When you were in a group, one of the hooks that we required was we were all about self-rehabilitation. So we required that every inmate assume their own responsibility for self-actualization. And that means they had to select their own career goals and objectives, and that we were going to then work to get them to be able to meet those career goals. So it wasn't a person telling a guy, here's the job that, we've got a school for carpentry, and so if you want a job outside, you got to go to carpentry. Well, hell, these guys didn't want to go to carpentry. The boxers, they wanted to box. They wanted to earn a living outside. The other thing is that each member of one of these groups had to take responsibility for their own self-resocialization. And that was, the responsibility there was I was asking them to repent and helping them to replace their previous set of values and beliefs with new ones. So, and that was this whole business of getting away from criminal behavior to non-criminal behavior. And so we were heavy into self-resocialization. And one of the most important things is I made them responsible for their own repair. Okay? We've got all this stuff done. What are you going to do to get yourself ready to deal with these three objectives to get yourself ready to go home? Identify for yourself and for this person and for me, what do you think you need to do in terms of getting your head straightened out so you can do the self-actualization, self-resocialization, and get you to move away from criminal behavior, non-criminal behavior. And so we work really long and hard in our groups doing those kinds of things. We call those things were hooks for change, resocialization, self-actualization, and self-repair. They were what I called hooks for change. They were the kinds of things that the men had to commit to take care of business in each one of those areas so that when they went home, they were ready to go home the way they ought to go home. And we're proud to say that we did some of that. We sent people home better than they were when they came in, and they did the self-repair. And James Scott, he left prison. Why are you making Scotty in charge of doing all this time? I said, just wait and see. Well, Scotty went home and he worked with kids. In fact, he worked at a gym on Broad Street, about 2 blocks from where I was raised. And he did a really good job with kids. His parole officer was really, really proud of what he was doing. He'd be at the gym every day, travel with the teams. There's a guy who had a lot of time. And my belief was that everybody goes home. So don't tell me how much time they have to do. Tell me what I have to do to fill that time to get them ready to go home. Tell me that. I want to know how much time they did. I took some criticism because I put Scotty in charge of the boxing program. Scotty had a long sentence. Well, Scotty was going to go home one day, some way. Some went home with a tag on their toe. Some went home because they got paroled. Some went home because their max expired. But they were all going out. They were all going to leave the person. And we had to get them ready to leave, those that didn't have a tag on their toe, in the way that was get them to do the kinds of things they needed to do to be rid of criminal behavior and into self-rehabilitation and non-criminal behavior.
Right.
So I don't know if I answered your question or not, but I tried.
Well, no, it was great. Listen, the listeners of the Boxing Breakdown are probably with their mouths hanging open because it really is an interesting story, and I just find it fascinating. I also wanted to point to your book, that your memoirs, about your life, and much of what we're talking about here, I would assume, is in the memoirs. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the memoirs and really just kind of like key in on the, it's the name of the book is Not on My Watch, but just tell us a little bit about the content of the book and what's in there.
Sure. The name of the book was when right a day or two after the riot at Rahway ended, the warden at the Trenton State Prison where I was working asked me if I would accompany him to Rahway. He needed to do an inspection. And I thought to myself, why me? I'm a director of education, and, why am I doing this? Maybe he's just asking me to be his escort. Well, it wasn't. We went there, and I learned a lot of things from him and saw a lot of things and talked to a lot of people. And the last thing that happened was I was standing in the prison rotunda, and the rotunda was full of broken debris, bloody bed blankets, bloody towels, just a real mess. And I stood there and I looked at that and I said, you know something? If I ever get a chance to run one of these places, something like this will never happen on my watch. And so that's why the book is called Not on My Watch. In the book, it starts off with my early childhood and how what I had to go through helped me to understand why the people in prison had some of the same things to go through that I had to go through. I didn't have a charmed life coming up. There was a lot of things that I learned, and so there's a little bit about that. The book starts off, though, with me riding on a train coming home to Morrisville, Pennsylvania. I was the director of education, and I was going to NYU to get my doctorate. And I was on the way home from NYU going to Morrisville. The train passed by Rahway Prison, and what I saw was something that got me concerned because I saw floodlights just lighting the place up. And I said to the guy who was riding with me or something, I said, there's something bad going on at Rahway. Well, it was the start of the riot. And when I got home, I got really busy. The warden kept me busy working on it. So that's the way it starts, with me on the train, witnessing the back of the prison and the start of the riot. Then it goes to my upbringing in a small town coal mining town in Jessup, Pennsylvania. And, I was potty trained in an outhouse. That was our bathroom. We had no running water.
Wow.
Candles were how we lit the house. Coal that I, as a 5-year-old, and my brother and sister, there was a railroad tracks in front of our house, and my mom used to make us walk the tracks with buckets every day to pick up coal so she could cook our food and keep the house as warm as one stove could keep it. And so, that taught me, there was a lot that I learned, about that helped me in dealing with people in need, and the people in prison were people in need. They needed help, and if I could help them, then that's what I was going to do. And I learned that from having to come up hard, and I didn't want them to continue on the same path that they were. I wanted to continue on another path. And then we have another chapter called Under the Dome. It's about my first week on the job and the things that I learned. I found immediately that I had a number of inmate threat groups that were really in charge of the prison. They were stealing from people in their cells. They were burning people in their cells. They'd take some kind of a rag with some kind of a gasoline or something on it, walk by an inmate's cell that they wanted to do some harm to, light the rag and that bottle and throw it into their cell. The guy couldn't get out of the cell. We had some guys really burned up before I got there, burned up pretty bad. And again, not on my watch. That wasn't going to happen. We're definitely not into that. So
wow.
We go into some of that stuff about what I found when I got to Rahway, and then how I decided how I was going to help these people and how I was going to deal with the establishment of self-rehabilitation, making people responsible for their own rehabilitation, but being there to help them in every way possible to make that happen. They were going to have to make the decision as to what they were going to learn themselves, what they wanted to do when they went home, and how they were going to do it. Then we were going to work on it together as a team to make that happen. And we had 13 groups like that. It was very, very successful. Still today, I had an inmate come to see me one day right after Christmas, and he said, Warden, I couldn't give my daughter a Christmas present. And so we talked, and I got him to think about working with the Marines. They do Christmas toy drives and whatnot. Well, that became an inmate group. And, 1 year, not too long ago, they're still in business, they collected some $20 million worth of toys that they repaired and then distributed to Indian reservations, to ghettos, to kids in need, all over the country. And it's still going today. So, that's a lot of what's in the chapter. How I did what I did with these groups, and how we made it work for each of the various groups. Then the next thing goes into we called it unexpected inheritance. I inherited 9 riot demands that hadn't been dealt with 2 years after the riot. And so we went through the whole chapter and talked about how we dealt with each of the riots. And it wasn't me, it was a team. It was inmates working together with officers and correction supervisors and myself, trying to figure out how the hell we're going to do this. And, we did a great job. And it wasn't me, it was a team of people that they just did fabulous things with those riot demands, and we dealt with every one of them. We finished every one of them, and when you read the book, you'll see that how we did it, how we dealt with them, and what we did to resolve those issues. That brought a lot of peace to the prison. People saw that I was serious. That, in fact, one of the things they thought would never happen was for me to release escorts on a furlough to do a concert at Symphony Hall in Newark, New Jersey.
Yeah.
Well, they found that I was the real deal when I opened the door and let those guys out with the escorts. They went to Symphony Hall and did one heck of a concert. So that's a chapter of those are the riot demands, and then a chapter that I call Footsteps. And my boss was hearing footsteps. My boss thought I was after his job. I was getting too much publicity, and I wasn't getting any because I didn't want any. The prison was getting the publicity, and I demanded that the inmates get the publicity because they did it, not me. But anyway, he thought that was just one of his reasons for moving me, was I was just too concerned about Scared Straight publicity. Well, I had one interview, in all the time that Scared Straight was going, one interview. But he used it as an excuse to get rid of me. So the chapter is about footsteps and how all of that came down, how I got moved out of a job where I thought we were doing a great job to a desk job. And then it all fell apart. They made sure that not 4 or 5 years after I left, it was gone. But what's really happened? I met a man called Dennis Porter. Dennis went into Rahway Prison a few years after I left, and he picked up the ball of what I was doing and created his own group. Created a group called the Prodigal Sons and Daughters, and they were out in the streets. They're in business for 35 years right now, doing a great job helping people on the streets the same way we help the people in the prisons. And he picked that up by, he's giving me credit for the whole thing, and I don't deserve the credit. It was his baby. But he said it was the influence I had on him and the kinds of things he heard about what we did at Rahway and how we did it. And he finished that damn proposal for that group while he was finishing time in in a hole. He was in a hole writing the last few parts of that plan. It's still going 35 years later. You might want to look him up. Prodigal Sons and Daughters, and it's Dennis Porter. I'm really proud of him, and he said he was not a lifer, but he had went in for murder.
Wow.
And the job they're doing, they've got a corporation in Africa. they've got corporations in another states, all part of his model that he developed in the hole at Rahway Prison. So, there's the footstep chapter deals with the why I think I got moved. And you know what? Honest to God, I'll go to my death believing this. Somehow my director, my commissioner, got word that I was planning an escorted furlough for Scotty to go out and fight for the title. And he was concerned about my publicity for Scared Straight, which I got done. Just imagine what would have happened if Scotty had gone out and won the damn title. That publicity would have been, and so he didn't want that to happen.
Wow.
Scotty defeated Richie Cates on March the 10th. My plan was to have Scotty ready to go on furlough on March the 17th.
Wow.
I got moved days before then.
And you think it was all connected?
He didn't want the title fight. He just didn't want the title fight. I believe it right down in my gut that's why I was moved. I feel really bad for that because I feel like I let Scotty down.
Yeah.
He deserved that title fight.
Well, I will say that, being, something that I'm sure you are extremely proud of, you were recently inducted into the New Jersey Boxing Hall of Fame. What was that like?
Oh God, I was so thrilled. I couldn't believe they called me and asked me if first of all they had their lawyer call me to find out if I would accept it. They didn't want to say they were giving me if I wouldn't accept it. Right. I said, heck yeah, man, I want to accept it. I got 4 guys that were in my school that have been inducted. It'd be an honor to be in there with them.
Who were the 4 guys? Tell us the 4 guys.
Dwight Kwawi Muhammad, the guy who was the middleweight champ of the world. Yeah. Eddie Johnson, who became the first licensed referee. James Scott.
Wow.
And Dwight Kwawi Muhammad's brother. I forget his first name, but he kept the name Braxton. Kwawi's name used to be Braxton, and he changed it to Muhammad. But his brother kept the name. So they're the 4 who were inducted. And yeah, I wanted to get inducted. I wanted to be part of the guys that I was proud of. I mean, and the school was less than a year old because I started the program, less than a year before I got fired. I hate to say fired, but that's how I feel it was.
Wow.
You had 4 guys inducted to the Hall of Fame. Jersey Joe Walcott gave Eddie Johnson a license as a referee. I mean, we were on our way, I think, to something really big. And the Boxing Hall of Fame, they recognized that I made a contribution to boxing, even though I wasn't a boxer. That I made a contribution to the sport of boxing. And I was flattered by it. I mean, it's a proud moment in my life. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I mean, it's and what a fortunate occurrence for you to be the warden of that particular prison and turn it around. From the most violent place to a place that was as civil as you would expect it could be, being that it is, a prison, maximum security prison. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and violent as all be Jesus. And wow. How I can prove that we turned it around, and we were bad when I got there, but in 1978, and it's available from somewhere on the internet, the Justice Department. There was a group from California, a research company, that were charged to find out which of the 5 maximum security prisons in America were the most stable.
Wow.
Well, hell, we had a riot in 71, and here we are in 78. They're trying to identify the most stable prisons. And wouldn't you know, Rahway was one of the 5 most stable maximum security prisons in the country. So I guess that's my proof that I think we did something good.
Bob, do you talk to us a little bit, really quickly, talk to us a little bit about fighters, for example, like Bernard Hopkins, who was also incarcerated, came out, turned his life around, and really, is just an outstanding citizen. Tell us about your impressions about a fighter like that and others as well.
I think that the literature today is full of boxing in prison. They're starting to recognize today, the people that write these books, that boxing is truly a form of, not rehabilitation, but a form of desistance, a way to take people away from criminal behavior and move them to non-criminal behavior. Well, we were doing that in the 70s. They're writing about it today.
Yeah.
And so, the guy I was telling you about, the brothers and sisters, he was a lifer. He came in and was doing a big sentence. And he went home and he boxed. He was in the school for that short time that it existed after I left. But he was in the school and he came out really, really good. He's 35 years, crime-free, running a corporation that's been in business for 35 years, and they're doing business in Africa, helping people in Africa. Can you imagine that? Wow. That's a hell of a story. So I think boxing in prison is one of the best forms of helping people turn their lives around that you can offer them. If you can teach them how to read and write and get them into boxing, that's one great way to get people free from criminal behavior.
Well, Bob, boxing, the thing that's amazing about boxing is that in the gyms, first of all, in New Jersey, there are some amazing boxing gyms. There are amazing coaches. There are amazing people dedicated to this very work in the gyms. And what I know is that, in walks almost every day in a boxing gym anywhere in New Jersey, a child on the precipice of ending up in jail and being on the streets and getting involved in gang activities and committing crimes. And, they go and walk into a boxing gym and literally their lives are altered. They're disciplined. There are father figures. There are structures in place to teach young people, how to discipline themselves. Because, the word discipline does mean to teach oneself, which is what you pointed to earlier on in the conversation about, you wanting to, put in a program that really had the prisoners themselves rehabilitate themselves. This is what the boxing gyms really represent, in that young people walk in with little guidance, little direction, and there is hope for, a brighter future through sport, and through, camaraderie and through friendships. And so I think that what you were onto in the prisons is exactly what all the boxing coaches and people who are running boxing gyms are really about. So I commend you, and it's just fascinating to hear your story.
You know what? That's interesting, because that I think is a way in the community to get these kids away from criminal behavior into non-criminal behavior. And it works. Yeah. I'll be damned if it doesn't work.
It really does.
Yeah. And they're writing about it today. They're writing books about how you deal with juveniles in boxing in prison. It's a big topic today, and I wish it would have been that way in the 70s, but I'm glad that it's happening now. It really is a good feeling. And it's good to know that. I didn't know that they're doing it out in the gyms and in the community, and they're turning young kids' lives around, because that's the time you got to grab them when they're, before they hit the reformatory. Grab them early on. And it sounds like they're doing a great job. I'd like to know if you guys could help me be in touch with some of those people that run those places. I'd like to talk to them.
Yeah, I'd be delighted. Harold, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Hey, during the 80s, when you had already left questionable, if you will, policy-wise. So it was during the 80s and 90s, was there anything like that available? Were you able to put your hands on anything like that? Or why wasn't that, continued going forward after you were supplanted?
Yeah. After I left, we didn't last much more than less than a year. That was when I left. The first move by the commissioner was to move me. The second was to move James Scott to Trenton Prison out of Rahway on a trumped-up charge. He was set up. He was definitely set up. Andrew Mambo, the guy who did The Fighter Inside, I don't know if through ESPN, I don't know if you guys have heard it, but Andrew Mambo said that, everybody tells him that Scotty was set up, and the guy that set him up had a history of setting him up, a lieutenant that I despised. And so when Scotty went, there went to school, there went the program, and it just died. Thankfully, Louisiana picked it up at the Angola prison, and it's still going today. As I said, it's going in Thailand at a Thai prison, and they're fighting there. They call it boxing your way out of prison. I mean,
wow,
what a concept! What a concept, and it sounds like they're doing it out on the street too, boxing to stay the hell out there in the first place.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I answered your question or your comment, but
well, I just know that when you left, you were still in the system, and were you able to do anything further in the 80s and 90s during that time? And then I read that you consulted for a while. So while you consulted for those 22 years, were you able to implement anything like this, or it was just something that was available to you in the early 70s, late 70s, and it was never, put in place again? Was there anything that prevented you from doing that?
Well, let me tell you a little story about how tough it was to get things done in the 70s. In the 70s, all of the experts said build more prisons and adopt a policy of lock them up and throw away the keys. That's what the experts were writing about, and that's what was happening. They were building more prisons, and the whole thing turned into punishment and lock them up. And here's this young school teacher, they called me because they came from education. Here's this young teacher coming into this prison, swimming against that tide. He can't make it. But we did. So, but when I went out and I was consulting, I didn't find anything like it. But I remember after I left Rahway, I was asked to go interview for a warden's job in Brushy Mountain, Tennessee, Brushy Mountain Prison, State Prison. Brushy Mountain is the prison that James Earl Ray escaped from. And they had me sit and meet with a group of inmates in the afternoon. First I met with the administration. They were interviewing me for the job. But I met with a group of inmates. And every one of them said, when and how, if you get here, can we get this thing started? I mean, they were fired up and ready to go. I think that was true all over the country. But, I guess people were afraid to swim against that tide and not take on that lock them up and throw away the keys mentality. So there wasn't much. Angola, thank God for Angola State Prison, and Thailand, but not much here.
So you were anti. You're saying when you had opportunities to kind of implement this, you're saying, well, when you were there or in a facility, what have you, you could not do this type of program. You couldn't put that kind of thing together in that environment. Right.
Yeah, that's right. It was, I guess wardens were afraid back then because it was pretty heavy. The prison system turned into what I like to call a lock them up and throw away the keys. There was a line in one of the books that I read that the reason that we had to do this was because nothing works. Can you believe that? Nothing works. And these are people who are the academics and the researchers and the people who are supposed to know their stuff. So there were probably a lot of wardens who would like to have done something. I created, and then my boss, he was kind of funny. I created a scheduling system when I was at Rahway. Correction officers were making a lot of money, and the money was overtime. They were just, and I looked out in the parking lot and I saw BMWs, I saw campers, I saw people going on cruises, and I looked, and there were some guys making a hell of a lot more than the warden on overtime. And so I challenged myself to do something about overtime. The year before I got there, they had spent $2 million on overtime. And I challenged myself, I was going to cut that in half the first year there. And I set out to learn as much as I could about how to schedule people. And a lady in the Federal Bureau of Prisons helped me an awful lot. I built a scheduling system that was really a manual computer. It was done on the wall. And when we took the $2 million and we took away 1.6, left $400,000. My boss would not put it into the other prisons. He wouldn't put it into the other. Can you imagine that? I had a solution to a statewide problem, and he wouldn't do it. And that may be one of the reasons I got moved. That's why we call the book a chapter Footsteps, because I think that's what he was. He was hearing my footsteps, and I didn't want his job, but he thought I did.
Wow. So
the way to take care of that was to get rid of me, get rid of Scotty, and everything. At that point, everything just fell apart. But I'm making some contacts now to his prodigal sons and daughters. I've talked to an inmate by the name of Keith Hill. Keith was one of the guys that was in segregation that was coming up Route 1 to my prison because of the bloodbaths that were going on in the Trenton Prison. And so Keith was one of the guys that came. And so I got to talk to Keith now, years later, many years later. And he's with Prodigal Sons and Daughters, doing a hell of a job. And he was in the boxing school. And he was one of the guys who would lead Scotty out to the ring for a fight. And how they'd have a little entourage walking him into the ring. Keith was one of the guys, he was close to Scotty, that walked him out into the ring. And so now he's writing. He's going to write about his experience in segregation during that whole time and the kinds of things that were done. So I'm starting to meet, people that I worked with back then. And they're really so grateful for the things that they were able to accomplish on their own. Because of what they did at Rahway while they were in the free community. Dwight Keith right now is a minister, and he's a counselor, It's just fabulous to meet these guys. This guy with Prodigal Sons and Daughters was in for murder, and he's out 35 years doing stuff that he thought he learned from me just by being in that atmosphere. I told him, you're crazy, it's not me, but he wrote a big piece that embarrassed me. He wanted to give me credit for everything, and I don't want any credit. I just wanted to continue to do a good job. But there's just so much that can be done on a national level that maybe we're back to that old lock 'em up and throw away the keys mentality, because I don't see anything out there that's worth talking about. Nothing. And that's a shame.
Yeah.
Because that's needed.
Well, we really do need it, because we need to keep...
You're dealing with a lot of minorities that, they're just writing them off. I think that's why you ought to read that book on boxing, and I can send you the referral. That's the book. It's an article in a magazine, Boxing and Incarceration. And they deal with what we did in the whole African-American system. And there was some thought that I was like, Who's the black Supreme Court Justice? Douglas, was it?
Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah, they compared a little bit to what I was doing with what the slaveholders were doing back in the slave days, where in order to buy peace with the slaves, they would create competition between them, like wrestling or fighting. So the feeling was that would horizontalize the behavior. In other words, they wouldn't beat on administration anymore. They'd be beating on themselves. And that was the theory then. And I was so interested in reading that. I mean, this guy wrote one hell of a story. I really think you ought to read it. I think he nailed the whole situation about minorities and how boxing can be and should be a way to take those people who really can benefit from it and who want to do it and put them in an environment in a prison where they can do that.
Well, yeah, and there's tons of other things that can, serve as a a form for rehabilitation. It's not just boxing. I mean, there's there's plenty of other things for different types of folks. And what we just happen to be touching on is a little bit about the correlation between the sport of boxing and young men, and having them utilize boxing as sport, as a way to learn. This doesn't mean that they even have to spar or box anyone else. It means that they can learn discipline. They can learn it in martial arts. They can learn it through religion. There's a lot of ways that you can learn, the same kind of thing. And I want to make sure that we underscore that, and really, we're just talking about the relationship between boxing and, the prison system. And I think that, if whatever the antidote is, what our goal as a society should be is to keep as many young men and women out of the prison system as possible, and that is a particular focus on minorities and black and brown people that tend to be more susceptible to for a variety of reasons that we all know very well, and we have to do everything we can to make sure that we keep black and brown children and men and women out of prison, because it's not a place for anyone.
Yeah.
I have a final type thing I want to ask, if you don't mind. Hey, so you owned a company at the time, and as a consultant, and you owned a company. So, of course, you had to solve a decision in your mind how you wanted to work this, and how you saw how it worked, and how it was profitable, not profitable, but it was beneficial for the inmates who were concerned. So when you had that company, and you went to implement this, you owned the company, and they came to you for consulting and what have you, and when you offered this discipline, this understanding to the owners of these facilities or what have you, did they take to it? They didn't want to take to it, or it was something that you felt you didn't need to implement at the time? I mean, was it the temper of the country at the time, where as you said, throw away the key, that type of thing? So what kind of pushback stopped you from or your company from moving forward with this and kind of forcing you in this situation, knowing the benefits of it? I mean, what stopped that situation? At that time, you wasn't no longer under the auspices of the government, anything like that. So whatever you need to do, I guess you could have, but what happened? Was it just the climate in the prison industry itself, or what was that pushback?
A lot of it had to do with the climate in the industry itself, and a lot of it, the Trenton Prison, their way of rehabilitating was punishment. That punishment was a way to keep people out of prison. Can you imagine that? They practiced punishment. And so in my travels, and we were around the country consulting, I didn't have many people interested in wanting to talk to me about that kind of stuff. I had the wardens more interested in me talking to them about how they could reduce their overtime so that they didn't get fired. They had pressure on them because of overtime. So we helped maybe 10% of the prison systems and maybe 20 county systems, to do that. But I really didn't get hardly any talk about wanting to do some of the things we did at Rahway. And that puzzled me. And it's a shame. There's so much work that needs to be done. Starting with the youth. I like that idea with the boxing gym. There's just so much work that needs to be done, that can be done. You just have to find the people who are dedicated enough to devote their lives to try to help other people. And I had a lot of adversity to cope with in my life. I was a decent pitcher, and I had my left hand cut off. And the last day of a summer job, just before I went back to my sophomore year of college, I lost my pitching hand. So I had to deal with that. I had to put myself together. I lost my job. So there was adversity that I had to deal with, and so I I had to work with people to try to help them deal with their own adversity. And getting incarcerated is one hell of an adversity. They trying to get people and getting people, the youngsters, not even wanting to come to prison. That's why we did the Scared Straight thing. We're going to try to keep people out of prison. The goal of the Lifers group was juvenile awareness. They wanted to make the juveniles aware of the results of their criminal behavior, and so that was really good. There was a bunch of images. What I said earlier was the researchers, said we were hurting kids. Kids were going to get involved in more crime after they went through the Rahway program, the Lifers Juvenile Awareness Program, than they would if they hadn't gone through the program. I didn't believe that. But, that's what they said. That's some of what was used against me, that here I had this program and I was harming kids.
Wow.
And so that was not good. And I was getting too much publicity, which I got none. I really could check every newspaper from here to the end of the world. And I challenge you to find more than one interview that I gave about Scared Straight. And I did it with Dick Cavett. After Scared Straight was shown nationally, Dick Cavett interviewed 4 or 5 of us for a half an hour, and that was it. That was the whole deal.
Well, Bob, listen, we're just rounding out about an hour. We were only going to spend a half an hour. We've spent an hour on this podcast, and it has been truly riveting. And I just want to say thank you so much for being with us tonight on the Boxing Breakdown. And for those of you tuning in and listening, please make sure you pick up the memoir for Bob Hatrak, Not on My Watch. Get it. I know you'll love reading it. This podcast has been, I can't wait to go and watch this thing back because it's so riveting to hear you talk about, the prison systems and what you've done. And Harold, thanks for being on the broadcast tonight. And until next time, you guys, we'll see you very, very soon. Thank you, Bob, for being with us.
You guys honored me by letting me talk about the days when I was the happiest.
Yes.
Thank you very, very, very much.
It was our honor to have you on the program. So thank you so much for being with us. And until next time, folks, we'll see you on the next episode of the Boxing Breakdown. Take care. Goodbye, Bob.
Yeah, bye-bye. Thank you so much, guys.
You're so welcome.
Thank you.
Fight fans, join host Mark Roxy and special guests as they break down all aspects of the boxing world, including news, business, management, training, promotions, fan reactions, upcoming events, matchups, future boxing stars, title fights, state of the boxing world, and all the stuff you don't see when you watch boxing. This podcast is released each week on Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Live streamed on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook Live. It's the Boxing Breakdown, hosted by Mark Roxy.
And Harold Hunt. Peace and love, everyone. Till the next time.
Okay, Sharon.